All right, ladies and gentlemen, if we can take our seats. This is a real honor for us. As should be really obvious by now, the department is celebrating its centennial this year. This is our 100th birthday, and we have a series of events that we're planning over the course of the year. But we're starting it off with a true salute to Professor Moyses Szklo. He's one of the stalwarts of our department. I ran across Moyses in the mid 1970s, but we really got to know each other for doing Epi 2 under George Comstock as lab instructors for 5 years. And so every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from, I guess it was 10 to 12, along with a couple of other senior faculty members. I was a little kid, but it was a remarkable experience to really get to know Moyses. And, you know, over the last 40 years, we've been working together, and it's really quite remarkable. So without further ado, I want to pass this on to Joe Koresh to introduce Moyses.
So thank you very much, David, and I look forward to a wonderful day. I mean, David had the idea of doing the departmental centennial, and Moyses is gracefully agreed to be honored by us, and it's not so easy when you have a humble person to be agreeing to all this. So 100 years for the department. These are slides David was going to show, but I'll show them for him. The 100 years of the department has spanned, wonderful chairs. And I think it's interesting in having the centennial seminars and the centennial professors that people like Moyses have spanned a good chunk of time, right? So in doing this, I thought it was useful to not just spend the whole time honoring Moyses, but actually hear from him first person, what happened over these years. And I look forward to that, and I think it'll be wonderful. So in terms of introductions, right, what's happened during this time, and in thinking about the introductions, my first opening thing was to say, well, Moyses needs no introduction. And then in some sense it's true, but in another sense, universities are very interesting places, right? Because students come every year, so for them there's a new slate every year, and as professors we have to meet the new standards every year, which I think is a wonderful thing about a university, that you get reborn every year. And then academic generations are pretty short, so you train doctoral students, they become professors, they train the next people. And then pretty soon, it's not clear that everybody knows all these things that have happened. So I think that's the wonderful thing about an event like this, is to both honor the past and learn from the past in a longer time period than many, many people know, and that's different time periods for different people. First of all, this shows us Moyses in a typical humble fashion. I think he'll be more comfortable watching than speaking, but today we're going to put you on the spot. And I wanted to thank his family. Hilda, his wife, they celebrated their 50-year anniversary, I think, last year, is here, along with Mar. Where are you, Hilda? Oh, right there. So Hilda's right there next to, with Richie pointing down. And Mariana, his daughter, and Alice, his granddaughter, are here. So we've got 3 generations of the Szklos. So thanks for coming. And then, in preparing for this, we spoke and we had to prepare for what to do. And it's interesting what Moyses chose to say. So this is my recollection. Moyses said, "I appreciate the honor, but I've just been doing my job." So obviously my job was to not let him off the hook. So I said, yes, but doing all the right things for 40 plus years is worth honoring, right? And I think in some sense, George would say the same sort of thing. A lot of people I'm just doing my job. Well, it turns out if you do your job great for 40 years, that is quite exceptional. And then Moyses said, and I said, sorry, you'll probably be embarrassed, but it's all true, right? If the truth is embarrassing, that's okay. If it's embarrassing in a good way, much better. So my comeback was celebrating the right things elevates us all, which I think is the reason to celebrate people. It's not just about the one person, it's because it's really about a community where I think our values are good, and I think there's something good about coming together about good values. So I think it's no accident that the department chose Moyses for this centennial celebration. And really, the things that came to mind are methodologic rigor, wisdom, compassion, dedication to epidemiology in the service of health. He's always told me when we've met, so is it going to make any difference? And then importantly, integrity, humor, and humanity. Right? So that's the amazing thing with Moyses. Whenever you meet with them, it's really about you as a person and relating to you in a direct way, being a mentor and a friend. And then I have a couple of pictures. You'll see more upstairs of me embarrassing Moyses in case you think it's the first time. This was the Christmas party where we had to draw on top of our heads on a plate. But he's very good-natured about this, so thank you. And then, then the introduction, so like 3 serious slides of career highlights, and the CV's got lots of stuff, but I abstracted a couple of things. Major cohorts. Moyses was the initial chairman to lead off the ERIC study, which has over 2,000 publications, the MESA study, which has over 1,000, maybe over 1,500 publications. He was the mentor to studies. So after a while, at the beginning, you're on the field writing the papers, then you lead the studies, and then you lead the people who lead the studies, who lead the people who write the papers, right? So I think he's done all of that for major studies in Brazil, including ELSA and the study of cardiovascular risk in adolescence. He may tell us a little more about that. My impression is it's over 50,000 and maybe even much more than that adolescents. Editor-in-chief of American Journal of Epidemiology for over 3 decades now. Teaching and mentorship, we'll hear all about that in multiple countries. Core departmental course, multiple golden apples, leading to a major textbook. Service to the American Public Health Association, chair of the epidemiology section, vice president, major roles in SCR, major societies in Brazil, the National Academy of Medicine, the Academy of Sciences. And he's got many awards, but this one is my favorite title, Commander of the Brazilian Government. Nonviolent commander, but directly from the president of the country. So, a tall bar for a humble man. Themes. It's interesting to see what he chose as his research themes. Heart disease in women and social determinants of health from his dissertation type topics. And it's interesting, right? You start off in the right way, and then he mentors Ana Diaz-Rue later in the ERIC study to a New England Journal paper. She's now became chair and dean, all the while kind of being in the background, sort of mentoring and letting good things happen. And clearly, these are topics that were very much, right, we read an article with the doctoral students about the future of epidemiology, and they talked about social determinants of health, and disparities. Cardiovascular health and prevention to leading studies, cancer prevention to national prevention campaigns, which I think is very impressive, children's health to the largest ongoing cohort in Brazil, and thoughtful application of epidemiologic methods in the service of improving health and translation. So this is where I switch off to thanking Moyses, and I look forward to hearing from him. One other comment, since today instead of doing a whole hour of speaking about Moyses, we put him on the spot to speak to us and share some of his experiences. I'll also further embarrass him or not. He's turning 80 in December. So then we're going to have... You may have gotten a hold the date. We're going to have a birthday celebration, and we won't let him speak as much. So today, thank you very much for agreeing, Dr. Szklo.
Who are you talking about? Okay, so this is really the first time that I'm going to talk about myself. First time since I did my bar mitzvah speech many, many years ago. So it's really wonderful to see so many friends and students here, some people I hadn't seen for a while. And then, it makes me nervous to know there are 3 deans, 2 ex-deans and 1 dean. So this is really, actually I tend to get nervous every time I have to lecture, to make a presentation. Okay, so what do I do with this? So this, I have to get to my talk, and I don't know how to do that. Joe.
Laura's not here. We'll figure it out. Is it? Did she?
Oh, I think you have to turn it off. Turn this on view.
Let's just. Is this your
This is it.
Centennial?
Yeah. Okay. Excellent.
And then you just click on here for next.
Okay. So actually, the title of my presentation is really plagiarized from a book from Leonard Woolf, the first and last time that I plagiarized something, I hope. So this is a wonderful book. He was married to Virginia Woolf, and everybody, you know, I think it would be good to read his autobiography. Very, very interesting. So let's start from the beginning. Now, of course, I was born, etc. But in 1965, I was living in the second most beautiful city in the world, Rio de Janeiro. The first, of course, is Baltimore, everybody knows. And I got a hold of two books. One is by Jerry Morris, Use of Epidemiology. The other one was a textbook by Brian McMahon and Pugh. Brian McMahon at that time was the chairman of epidemiology at the Harvard School of Public Health. So when I wrote those books, I said, whatever I'm doing in medicine is probably not too right. You know, it doesn't have the enough scientific support. So I decided that maybe I want to become an epidemiologist. And but the first question that I asked myself after reading Brian McMahon's book is, does epidemiology work? So I decided to do a little experiment with students. I was an instructor of medicine in those times. So I decided to do a case control study of breast cancer because I wanted to see if I could replicate the findings of many other studies that had been done before. And I did that with the collaboration of 4 medical students. Well, I used them. So it was in one referral hospital in Rio de Janeiro. It was a matched pair case control study with 160 cases and matched pairs, matched controls. And the controls were interesting. They were women who, upon evaluation in the same referral hospital, had not been found to have breast cancer. So sort of a primitive counterfactual, right? And the interviews were done by the medical students. And lo and behold, results replicated those of previous studies for every single risk factor. So the question was answered like does. Epidemiology does work. So I decided to study epidemiology, and I got a scholarship from the Pan American Health Organization to come to the States to do an MPH, a Master of Public Health. And the PAHO liaison, asked me, do I want to go to Hopkins or to Harvard? And at that time, you know, all I knew it was 2 excellent schools. Now, of course, one more excellent than the other, but I didn't know them. So this is a true story. He said to me, let's toss a coin. If it is heads, you go to Hopkins. If it's tails, you go to Harvard. So here I am. So you know the answer, you know the solution. So I started to do my MPH, and I really fell in love with teaching of epidemiology at Hopkins. This Socratic process of asking and answering questions. And so I love the labs. And just 2 examples of exercises, one from Epi 1, the other one from Epi 2, and those are from 1971. And I found reports in those times. You had to write reports on every single exercise. So I find one from Epi 1, another one from Epi 2. And this is great. I think I'm going to frame this. I found George Combs's comments on one of the reports that I wrote about one of the labs. And he says that my report was good. And I never felt so good in my life. In those times, we had a grading system of 1, 2, 3, 4. So in Epi 2, I got a 1 minus. So interesting. So those are my mentors in the MPH and the RPH years. Abraham Lilienfeld, Leon Goris, George Comstock, and Luke Culler. Luke Culler was my advisor during my MPH. Then he left, went to Pittsburgh. And those are the giants of epidemiology, really. Those are the guys that really have made epidemiology exciting to me. Well, in 1975, I was hired as an assistant professor by Abe Lilienfeld. And my first grant was a case control study of aplastic anemia. And Abe Lilienfeld, who was the chairman, he told me, you know, you're doing a study of aplastic anemia, you had to talk to a certain expert in the medical school that I'm not going to name, and you'll see why. So I went to talk to that expert on aplastic anemia, and my English was so-so. I was very nervous. But he listened very politely. And then he told me something I never forgot. He said that, I thought that to know more about the etiology of aplastic anemia, extra creativity was needed. But perhaps an epidemiological study is sufficient. That is literally what he told me. Actually, I made a note afterwards because I couldn't believe. So I don't know if that was positive or negative. I still don't, okay? All right, let's jump to 1980. You know, I'm giving you some important snippets, important to me, of course. Anything important in 1980? I was promoted. That's the minor event, okay? Now, this is the major event. Look who I met. Actually, Richie Sharrett told me that this is wrong. It should be look whom I met. But, you know, Laurie said, one of the copy editors who is here, great copy editor, she said, is who? So I was undecided. I spent like 5 minutes trying to decide what to do. Look who I met. And this is... This is David, for those who can't recognize him. His green ears. That was important because David became my friend and we've known each other for almost 40 years. Okay, jump into 1983. 1983 was an important year for me because the school created the Johns Hopkins the Institute for Epidemiology and Biostatistics. And those are the three guys who made it happen. D.A. Henderson, who was the dean, Edith Shorich was an associate dean, and Leon Goris was, what happened to my water? Oh, excuse me. Unfortunately, I don't have a cup, but this is a very informal presentation, so I'm going to, okay, not too elegant, but. And Leon Goris was the chairman of epidemiology at that time. And this is the first ad for the Summer Institute. And you will notice the tuition price. The tuition was $350 for one course and $650 for two or more courses. And the first year, in 1983, we taught just a few courses by people many people here will recognize. And now we have about 40 courses. So a little bit of an expansion of the Summer Institute. And, you know, we had just a few foreign countries represented in the Summer Institute. And now we have about 40 countries, and things have evolved. So we have had students from all over the world with some maybe exceptions, as you can see, South America, Paraguay. In the United States, I think it's Wisconsin, isn't it? I don't know. I think we have to do something about that. So some countries in Africa, Angola, Libya, and so on. But this is impressive, in my opinion. So in 1983, we had 110 students, and 10% were from outside the United States. In 2018, this year, we had about 442 students, about 20% from outside the USA. And 236 students, more than half, took courses for academic credits. And with 70 of those, 72% were degree candidates in our school, of whom 134 were part-time MPH students. So I think the Summer Institute is a good resource for the school as a whole. And then quite a few organizations have used the Institute as a resource, including the Pan American Health, World Health, and so on, CDC, Fogarty, and so on. Okay, now the Summer Institute has had a close collaboration with the Department of Biostatistics since the beginning. And from 1999, it became the Summer Institute of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. Since 1983, about 14,000 students attended the Summer Institute courses, which is really impressive. And famous alumni include Mike Clegg, who is right here taking pictures. Are you paying attention or just taking pictures? And Larry Apple, I don't see Larry, but those are the most famous alumni we had in the Summer Institute. And about 40 to 50% of institutes students have no Hopkins affiliation, so we have a lot of students from outside Johns Hopkins. The Institute attracts many individuals who do not have a lot of time to learn epi and biostat, and students whose schools do not have advanced courses, or people who don't have access to formal training, and those who have a greater interest in application. And the Institute also offers online courses. Okay, so this is D.A. Henderson's testimony about the Institute. And he says, D.A. Henderson was a dean before before Al, yeah. So the course was precedent setting for the school because at the time, there were no classes whatsoever from commencement until the early September. As it turned out, the course, which means the Institute, was widely received and permitted many to begin to comprehend the importance of epidemiology and biostatistics to public health. And from that beginning, a growing menu of courses and initiatives emerged to fill the summer months. An 11-month MPH program emerged, part-time and extended degree programs began. So the Institute had some impact in the school as a whole. All right, now jump into 1988. All of a sudden I had to become thick-skinned. So that had to be a change, and I discussed that with my psychoanalyst. It's not true, I was not doing it. So theoretically, he would say, just be ready. And, because it's not just science. You have to interface with authors. And if you don't accept and publish their papers in 24 hours, they get very upset. So, and in fact, I had an email a couple of years ago, which is an example of that. We had rejected a paper by a foreign author, and I got an email, and this is not a joke, this is true. And the email said, "What could I expect from an American editor? ? I will no longer buy American products." This is true. Okay, so as you know, the American Journal of Epidemiology started its life as the American Journal of Hygiene in 1920. So in a couple of years, we'll be 100 years old as well. And in 1965, it changed its title to American Journal of Epidemiology with Neil Nathanson as a managing editor. You can see people are really outstanding in the board of editors, people like Phil Satwell, who had been the chairman of epidemiology, Roger Harriot, who was I think, at that time, I'm not sure, he was a chairman of biochemistry, Ernst Stebbins, who had been the dean of the School of Public Health. And this is, Neil Nathanson wrote an editorial, which is really interesting, but one point that I wanted to emphasize is that he says that as far as we are aware, there's no journal in the English language which has the word epidemiology in its title. So the American Journal of Epidemiology may have been the first one with epidemiology in its title. And in 1979, we started a sister publication, Epidemiologic Reviews, as you see from the title, publishes reviews. and there's a list of the editors-in-chief, started with Phil Satwell in 79. The longest tenure was from Michel Ibrahim, who is sitting right there, who did a fantastic job. He was the editor-in-chief for 13 years. And David Celentano is now the editor-in-chief. It's also a very successful publication. Now let me talk a little bit about the Sheraton years. Okay, what are the Sheraton years? This thing moves, so I have to be careful. I have to be careful here. So it started with the cubicles. So we are neighbors. When I was doing my MPH, and I think you were doing the first year of the RPH, and actually Al Sommer was also in our cubicle, who became the dean. So in those times, and I remember Al showing me the Hewlett Packard calculator he had bought for $500, I think, and who could do all kinds of things like sum, multiply, divide, and so on. But I think Sheraton, in 1984, this is important, he conceived and prepared an RFP for the first ever population-based landmark study of subclinical atherosclerosis, the atherosclerosis risk in community study. And that was really the grandfather of a lot of other studies done in our school, in our department, such as the MESA study and the cardiovascular health study. Now, let me tell you about one of the 1.5 brilliant ideas that I had since I was born. And that is, in 2000, I was looking for an assistant professor to help with the ERIC study. So I called Richard to get some names. And Richard said, "What about me?" "Well, are you serious?" I asked him. He's absolutely serious. "But you're not going to be an assistant professor." At that time, he was already an experienced epidemiologist. He had conceived this incredible study. I went to John Sammet's office. John Sammet was the chair. And I said, "We have to get this guy." Absolutely. And John agreed. So he became a faculty, now a professor of epidemiology, and he's done fantastic work as a faculty. Now, the ERIC study, I started as a PI, but now the PI is Joe Koresh. And he's the current PI and also the head of the George Comstock Center, where the Eric Hopkins study is based. And I think one of my claims to glory is to have been an advisor to Joe Koresh. So that figures prominently in my CV. But, it's really interesting. After a few months of advising Joe, a very strange phenomenon, not explained by science, happened. So this is what happened. Now, I had other excellent advisees as well, and I realized that the key to being a good mentor, and even get a mentoring award, is to choose students who don't need mentoring. And when I heard that Dean McKenzie was going to be here, I got a little nervous. And I decided to pay my respects by showing another great advisee, Jim Tush, who is sitting right there, who is now very important, professor and chair of global health at George Washington University. So, one of my interests has been the interface between epidemiology and health policy. And two of the major influences that I had were Morton Levin and George Comstock. Mort was an interesting guy. He had done the first well-done study of smoking and lung cancer. There had been a study in Germany which was translated, horrible study, a really poor study showing an association because the association is so strong. So Morton also developed the unadjusted population attributable risk formula. So he made important contributions to epidemiology. Yet, when he said to me, when I got the Frost Award from the American Public Health Association for my contributions to epidemiology, I was surprised, as I always saw myself as a public health officer. And he went on to say, my main contribution was not the lung cancer study, but rather to have facilitated the polio trials in New York and to have required that allocation be random. He was the health officer at that time of New York State. Now, George, of course, in his interview with Alfredo Morabia, he said, if it isn't ultimately aimed at policy, it's not worth doing. And so I'm happy to report that under David's leadership, there have been some important developments in terms of the interface with public health and policy. There is now an area of concentration and a certificate on professional epidemiology, and a committee was set up to discuss the conceptual framework of and the teaching and research on translation epidemiology, whose chair is David Dowdy. Now, these developments, in my opinion, I think you can handle a little bit of science now for the next 5 minutes. Make it important to think about semantic and other differences between etiological and public health epidemiology. And I have a couple of examples of conceptual differences between etiological and applied public health policy-oriented. The first one is confounding. Confounding in observational studies. Is it always a bias? Okay, what is the common reaction among epidemiologists and students of epidemiology when they face the issue of confounding? So confounding must be prevented, exterminated, destroyed, eradicated, executed. So there's a semantic conundrum. Is confounding always a bias? In some modern epidemiology textbooks, and biostatistics too, people classify bias as due to confounding, not due to confounding. Interestingly, in the older textbooks, if you go back to Lilienfeld's lectures and his textbook, he defines 3 types of association. Direct, which is etiological; indirect, that is confounded; and spurious, that is biased. And he calls direct and indirect, etiological and confounding, as real. So is it? So interesting, if you look at the natural history of a study, it's start with a hypothesis, go to the population, study participants, data collection, data analysis, study findings, manuscript. And each one of those steps has a bias, a possible bias, a potential bias associated with it. For example, plausibility bias when you develop a hypothesis. If I wake up at 4 in the morning and hypothesize that chewing gum causes kidney cancer, this is a ridiculous hypothesis, right? And then you have selection bias, information bias, analytical bias, inferential bias, publication bias. So where is confounding? It's not there. It's in the population. And I have an example, which I think is a great example. But before then, confounding is a phenomenon associated with observational study designs. We all know that, okay? Now, observational epidemiology is in good company. There are lots of observational science around, geology, astrophysics, etc. Although numerous policy decisions have been made based on valid observational data, residual confounding is always a threat to causal inference. However, question, is a confounded association ever useful? Okay, this is a good example. African American ethnicity and hypertension. So is it a etiological causal relationship, or is it a confounding? We know it's a confounding, severely confounded. There might be even some biological thing going on, but I think most of the association can be explained by social inequalities and their effects. Obesity, job strain, excessive salt consumption, and so on. So this is a confounded association, but is it useful? It is useful to know. Why is it useful to know? Well, it's a high-risk group. So you can do screening for identification and control of established hypertension and focus on this high-risk group to promote prevention or cessation of modifiable risk factors. So a confounded association is real. It allows us to identify high-risk groups. So is it a bias? Now, the classical answer for any epidemiological study, it depends. Now, if you say that, though, you have to explain it. Depends on what? Well, if the purpose is to infer a causal association, yes. But if the purpose is to identify high-risk groups, is no. And actually, I was lecturing when Donna Spiegelman, who is an important statistician, she suggested those 2 expressions, etiological confounding, when we want to infer a causal association, and public health confounding, when the purpose is to identify high-risk groups. Now, there's another thing that is quite different between what we usually do and what we should be doing. Do we add or do we multiply? Well, epidemiologists and epidemiology students are addicted to ratio-based measures of association, right? Hazard ratio and so on. And close to 100% of database epidemiological manuscripts report hazard or odds ratios. but is the multiplicative model the best to express relationships? So in general, what we do is we report hazard ratios because we use a multiplicative model. So it's almost like, we do what the model tells us to do. And this is a very interesting sentence that I summarize here. The paper is a little old, but it's an interesting sentence. The use of statistical analysis of epidemiological data to infer biological processes can be misleading. As an example, we consider the multistage model of carcinogenesis. Even if carcinogenic factors act independently, some pairs may fit an additive statistical model, some are multiplicative. So, in the absence of a consensus with regard to the best model for human biology, which model is the most relevant to public health policy? So I'll take the example of interaction, multiplicative versus additive. And this is a real-life study of the relationship between asbestos and death rates from lung cancer, stratified by smoking. You can see the result. Look at the rate ratios. They are totally, strange. It looks like the rate ratio is greater for asbestos for people who never smoked, and is smaller for people who smoke. So this is really what negative multiplicative interaction is, totally counterintuitive, right? But if you look at the differences, then you see what happens. The absolute difference is much, much, much greater amongst the smoker, and the difference related to asbestos, much greater, which makes sense, a lot of sense, even biological sense. And actually, Ken Rotman would call this type of positive additive interaction, he calls public health interaction. Now, this is another example that may be a little bit more also relevant to medicine. And this is the relationship between having had a previous MI and the incidence of a subsequent MI. So people who have had a previous MI, we're talking about a recurrent MI, stratified by diabetes. Again, you see this thing here, which is totally strange, that the relative risk is greater for previous MI if people don't have diabetes. And yet, when you look at the absolute difference, so this is again a negative multiplicative interaction, you can see what you expect to see, that in terms of absolute excess, the people who have diabetes are the ones that suffer the most if they have a recurrent MI. And this is a very interesting phenomenon. You can see that the reference here is quite high, 20.2% for people without a previous MI but who have diabetes. When that happens, the ratio tends to go down. So I think you have to be careful. And in public health, we are concerned about absolute excess, not relative excess. And then I find, incidentally, most people don't realize that additive interaction can be evaluated in the setting of multiplicative models. So keep that in mind, okay? One final example, evaluation of interventions. So we have a trial A, the incidence in the control group is 20%, and the intervention group is 15%. So the relative risk is 0.75. And then you have trial B, and here the relative risk is 0.4. So there's a stronger association in trial B if you look at the relative risks. Now, Einstein says things have to be as simple as possible, but not simpler. So what is the simplest calculation that results in an effective measure of public health impact? Well, subtract. Okay, actually Al's calculator would allow you to do all those complex operations. So that will allow you to evaluate or estimate the number that need to receive the intervention to prevent the development of one event. And interestingly, the relative risk is smaller, it's closer to 1. But you only need to subject 20 people to the intervention to prevent one event. Whereas here, the relative risk is stronger, but you need 70 people. So again, the absolute excess, is what we are interested in public health, in policy, and even medicine. Okay, so just to summarize, some differences between the etiological versus the public health epidemiology. The etiological focuses on etiology, of course, and mechanisms. The public health focuses on application. The etiological favors relative measures. This is a simplification, of course. favors absolute measures of association. Etiological confounding is a bias akin to selection bias, but public health epidemiology confounding is useful to identify, real confounding, not bias, to identify high risk. And one other difference that I haven't speculated about in this presentation, etiological favors efficacy and public health favors effectiveness, okay? Okay, to finalize, I have taught at Hopkins for 43 years. That's why I look so tired. So what have I learned? I have learned that being challenged by students is a great way to learn and also to teach. I think it's crucial if we wanted to keep up our mind active and learn. And that learning will allow us to do a better teaching. We should listen and answer questions and have students disagree with us. This is important. Now, the main purpose of teaching is to teach students how to think, not what to think. This is a big challenge in teaching. Now it's my own selfish view about editing, scientific editing. It's a great way to teach is to ask students to do peer reviews on the faculty supervision. Actually, I think we should do that in our department. Now, some basic concepts, and this is something that is, I've been talking about for ages, that may be useful to inference are systematically neglected in many departments, not just ours. For example, cause of heterogeneity across studies. We learn systematic reviews, and most students know something about systematic reviews and meta-analysis, but they ignore causes of heterogeneity. And I just want to give you a couple of examples. One is incubation period, EPI 1. And, Armenian and Lilienfeld, many years ago, he wrote a paper showing that point epidemic curves of non-transmissible diseases follow the same log normal distribution that you see in infectious diseases. And they give examples like leukemia after the atom bomb explosion. So you have an epidemic curve, there's introduction of the explosion, number of cases. Now, of course, before the minimum incubation period goes by, the cases are not related to the exposure. And so the studies will not show association. If you get into the curve, the ascending portion, then the studies will show an association, which is something that happened, for example, the introduction of hormonal replacement therapy many years ago. And this is the Women's Health Initiative, which is a randomized trial in which people were given hormonal therapy for the first time. And you can see the first 3 years, they couldn't show an association. And the next 3 years, association is not perfect, but the association seemed to be there. So this is important. The other thing is variability. This is important. Most of what our department does is observation epidemiology. And many people don't realize if you don't have enough variability, you don't have an observational study. And this is a sentence from Winder and Stellman. For example, they are referring to case control studies, but it applies to many other types of study designs. If cases and controls are drawn from a population in which the range of exposure is narrow, then a study may yield little information about potential health effects. And this is what they say. If you study A, salt intake and systolic blood pressure, if there is no variability, the associations are going to be weak or going to be absent. In another study in which there is there's variability of salt intake, you see an association. Now, if you do a systematic review, you call it heterogeneous. It doesn't mean that the association is not there. It means that there's a reason why the results are heterogeneous. Okay. And that takes, there are simple things you can do, like if the distributions are normal, just calculate the coefficient of variability to see how much variation you have. I did a study in which I wanted to look at the thickness of the intimal medial carotid artery. And I wanted to look at that, see how early, it's a study in children, how early you would see variation in relationships with risk factors. But they all had almost the same thickness So we couldn't do a study. It's an important finding. I mean, it should be reported, but it means that you cannot do a study of determinants. Okay, so that takes us to ecological correlations, because this issue is very much related to ecological. So in epi courses, we learned that ecological correlation is synonymous with ecological fallacy, right? Ecological fallacy. So they're bad study designs. Okay, so correlation doesn't imply causality. We know that. It's not too funny. Nobody laughed. And then there's some, of course, ecological fallacy is a problem, you know. For example, if you eat more chicken, the crude oil imports are going to go up or down. If you eat less, it goes down with a correlation coefficient of 0.9. And this is real data. This is not fake news, okay? And then, you know, if you eat a lot of mozzarella cheese, the number of civil engineer doctors are going to go up. Now, this one, and this is this correlation, perfect, almost perfect, right? Now, this one you'll never guess, so I'm going to give you a respectable correlation coefficient between the number of storks and the size of human population. So, ecological fallacy is a problem, no question about it. But it so happens they're not ecological correlations, they're ecological fallacies. For example, it's salt intake in systolic blood pressure. In many populations, well, if you look at individuals in several populations in which there is very little variability, you won't see an association. Population A, B, C, D. But if you look at the average, you'll see a strong association. And in fact, the intersalt study shows an association, so it shows a correlation. It's not strong, but it's there. And those little points, those little dots are populations, not individuals. So this is an ecological correlation. Okay, the final idea before I stop is that I feel that some areas in our discipline deserve more attention, not just in our department. I mean, I was talking to Elizabeth Platz, and she told me she teaches about screening in her course on cancer epidemiology. But I think it should be almost a required course, because how can you be an epidemiologist and not know about screening? It's impossible, okay? And so screening, I started from the end. I'm going back to the beginning. Human biology is something else. The SCR meeting a few weeks ago, there was a session on what should be taught to doctoral students in epidemiology, and they talked about all kinds of fancy things that we all like, right? Mendelian randomization and propensity score and marginal structural equations and so on. So I had the guy who organized, I asked, what about human biology? I mean, you don't have to know human biology in general, but at least the topic that you're studying, you should be an expert on the human biology on that topic. The other thing is, because of lack of resources, most PhD theses now, and the RPH theses, are done with secondary data. And so we're not training our students too well on development of data collection instruments and primary data collection and quality assurance and control. They go with it. So this is what I had to tell you. I want to finish with this. This is a modified, because the original version makes it sound that I'm as tall as the other guys. So I didn't know that. I didn't want that. But I love this sentence. We're like dwarfs sitting on the shoulders of giants. We may see almost like them. Not because our sight is almost as good as theirs. I added the almost. Or because we're almost as tall as they are, but because they raise us up and by their great stature add to ours. This means that over my long life, I've had a lot of help. And I really want to thank everybody who helped me in general. But I also want to specify some categories. Now, this is very much a bridge, because if I had to put the names of everybody who helped me, it's another hour. So I just want to point out to a few people. My family, my wife of 51 years, she has strong shoulders, and I have stood on her shoulders for 55 years, I guess. My mentors, my special friends, people like Joe and Richie and David, who also have been my mentors, of course. The faculty, our department, and the school, great places, wonderful places. the chairs of epidemiology and biostatistics that have been incredibly supportive of the Summer Institute, the deans, all deans, without exception, from the A to Mike Clegg, to Al Sommer, to Mike Clegg, and to Alan, have been very supportive, not just of the Summer Institute, but also the AJE, the American Journal of Epidemiology. The staff of the American Journal of Epidemiology, we have a few people here represented, very competent. It's a delightful thing to have such an incredibly competent and nice staff. Harriet gives me mystery books that she reads and she likes, and I give her my mystery books. The Society for Epidemiological Research has been supporting the American Journal of Epidemiology for decades. Those people who encouraged me to write the textbook, particularly Michelle, who is sitting right there, and Leon Gores, the Eric and Ms. investigators and staff, the Summer Institute faculty, TAs and staff, the secretaries. I think Jenny is here, assistant. She was my assistant for many years. And she's in the reception room. Okay. And she is still my assistant, so she's still helping me, even though she's working now for the AJE. And that's it. And last, but not far from least, my students. Those are the people I learned from. Okay? Thanks. Sit down, sit down. Sit. Okay, thank you. You know, I'll do as a piano player if he played.
All right.
My balance is still okay.
So many thanks, for a wonderful talk. I kind of knew that by putting you on the spot, we'd be in for a treat, and it's been just wonderful. So before we go up to the reception, which will start at 1:30, we're right on schedule. We've allotted about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Since you said questions are welcome. So there are 2 microphones on either side. We're recording the session, so if you come to the microphone for questions.
I want to apologize in advance because I have a hearing loss. So I asked Laura if I can, even with the microphone, I may not capture the question. So Laura is going to repeat it.
Okay. Al is coming up, so I'll let Al have the first question.
It's not going to be a question. It's actually going to be a comment. That's good. That was terrific. I mean,
Thank you.
I feel 20 years younger watching you up there. I got to tell you. So it's already been mentioned that you were very jealous of my NIH-funded Hewlett-Packard calculator, and you've never let me forget that, because I had an NIH fellowship which allowed me $650 for books and supplies, and I blew it all on a Hewlett-Packard calculator. But the other thing that most people won't know, and I'm going to embarrass you about, is we used to have lunch regularly since we were...
Oh, that story again.
Yeah.
Can I make you ask it by the podium? That'll be easier with lighting.
Okay. By the podium. So this was a young fella here from Brazil. And he came,
nobody's perfect, right?
And he had very different expectations than some of us who were students together. And he used to assail me regularly at lunch. And why was I writing so many papers? 1 paper a year was really quite enough. I can assure you he's written many more papers than I have over his long and distinguished career. Keep it up, Moyses.
Thank you. Thank you.
So other questions are welcome, and I've noticed that it might be easier for you to see us rather than looking into the lights if people ask questions from here. So more questions are welcome. But maybe I'll ask a question because you set it up. You said we should work more on quality control. I wonder what you mean by that in studies, and I know things you've instituted in ARIC and other studies, and what can editors do about that? I've wondered, what should be the standard for quality control in any journal, And should journals that are read a lot, like AJE or New England Journal, have some minimal standard? And should it be any higher for AJE than New England Journal?
Yes. Yeah, I think actually it's really interesting. You know, I lead a workshop on preparation of manuscripts reporting epidemiological results of epidemiological studies. And one of the most commonly missing components of the A manuscript submitted to the AJE is the quality assurance and quality control. And sometimes they use vague sentences like, this questionnaire was validated. It doesn't mean anything. It was validated. What does it mean? So they fail to explain how the validation process was done, and they fail to report validation indices. So I think this is very important. I think, I'm sorry, I think I'm guilty of not having done enough from that viewpoint in terms of the manuscript we receive. If we asked every single author to add something about quality assurance and quality control, I'm afraid that not just the AJE, but all the epi journals, and maybe the clinical journals as well, could publish just a few papers. But I think your question emphasized the necessity of doing something about that, either through editorials or instructions to authors. I don't think we have that in our instructions to authors. So it's a failure, it's a missing portion.
Yeah, so wonderful. And I have, just to let the group know, under Moyses' leadership, the ARIC study repeats the visit for a subset of people, right? So then you know whether you're getting the same data or not. If you measure once, you assume you have the truth, but you may not. And I wonder, there's a big push to make a repository of all the data. We don't have to put it in the article. There could be a repository of the quality control, which may be just as relevant as the data. Otherwise, you don't know what you have. But I think Dr. Sheraton has a question.
Now, before you ask, let me just tell you one thing. You know, people sometimes they report that the kappa was 0.75, and they're very happy about it. Well, 0.75 may cause a lot of misclassification. And as an epidemiologist, you have to ask, for example, if you have two good, well-trained data collectors who are measuring weight, for example, why don't they agree in a certain proportion of the cases? So you have to ask that question. As an epidemiologist, you have to explore. You have to find out the answer. Is it because the scales are not well calibrated, or is it different understanding of the procedures, or whatever? So that's a big difference between a summary measure that you get and what happens in real life. You have to be very attentive all the time about that.
Moyses, you're also a commander of the Brazilian state, and you didn't say much about that, but I know that you've done a lot of very interesting work. One thing I think people here know almost nothing about is the work in adolescence and so on. And many in the audience come from places all around the world. Can you share something about your perspective on research outside of this country, and perhaps also why you focused on adolescence?
Yeah, I think I understand the question. Rich is usually very clear. So yeah, it's interesting. You know, the reason why that study was done was a study based on a random sample of adolescents all over the country, my native country, Brazil. And in Brazil, high school is mandatory. And families that send their children to high school, they follow the law. They receive some supplementary, some money to do that. So the high schools are a great sampling frame for drawing random samples. So we did that, and we studied 80,000. And the reason was that the health ministry in those times, a few years ago, was very concerned about obesity amongst the young people. And in fact, we found that in the age group that we studied, which was 12 to 17, about 35 to 40% were either obese or overweight, which is enormous. And I noticed anecdotally, in the old times, I went to Brazil and I asked for a sandwich. I felt cheated. I got a sandwich like this. Now I got a sandwich like that. I feel cheated again. I want the average. So, the culture of overeating and lots of fast food, McDonald's, Burger King, and so on and so forth, and the people who don't have a lot of access to healthy foods, they end up in McDonald's, Burger King, eating hamburgers, French fries. They're wonderful, aren't they? So outside the states, in my travels, epidemiology is more or less developed according to the country. In Holland, you have Erasmus that does high-quality epidemiology. They have a cohort study, the Erasmus cohort study. And in Italy, they have a little bit, but basically, epidemiology is America and England, Great Britain.
Joe just peer pressured me into asking a question, but sometimes we do need a little push. So this is my question, and I think a lot about this for our doctoral students, since we now have to sort of balance moving them through our program, but as you raised, that reduces the experience with primary data collection and developing data instruments. And so I wonder sort of what your suggestion would be on how we balance that, or how we can still fit that into our doctoral education, so that we aren't producing generations that see clean data sets and haven't gone through the hard labor or to really understand some of the complexities or messiness that underlies that. I think it's a really important component of our education here, since even outside of academia, as we move forward, data collection is critical and the first really important step in data analysis and interpretation.
I think I should refer it to the chair.
But I know his answer.
I think there are two factors that are militate against primary data collection. One is resource, financial funding, and the other one is time. Most students, they are rightly concerned about time because education can be fairly expensive in the school and elsewhere. I don't know, it's really interesting. It would be nice to have a place like the hospital where I did my first study. Incidentally, I called my first study a case history study. I didn't know anything about epidemiology in those times, instead of a case control study. It was published as a case history. I don't know if there was some place which would be a source of data, because people are concerned about sample size. I'm more concerned about having the experience, the exposure with primary data collection. So even, I remember a student I had who was doing her thesis on the basis of secondary data, and I asked her to do a pilot study at the emergency medicine department across the street. So she saw like 40 or 30 people, but the experience was invaluable because she had to produce a questionnaire, pre-test, pilot test, and apply it.
So you've been... Oh, I get the last word. Oh, it's not really a great question for the last word, but you've been faculty here for over 40 years, and I was wondering if you had thoughts on any changes of what it means to be a faculty or academic epidemiologist over that time. Do you feel like the job has changed for people or stayed the same, and for better or worse?
That's a difficult question to answer. The department became much bigger, of course. So in the old times, you had a chance to interact with your colleagues. Now I go to a faculty meeting. There are some people I don't know their names of, and so I think that was a, in quotes, negative development. The positive one is we have more expertise in our departments. We have people like you and people like the social epidemiologists who have joined us more recently. So I think the department has more breadth, and the depth continues to be the same. Incredible depth. When I was a student, I remember Abe Lilienfeld in the cafeteria having lunch with us very often and discussing ideas for studies. That doesn't happen anymore. I mean, faculty rarely get together. So I think this is something we should work on. The other thing is that with the development of statistical models, the differentiation between epidemiological and statistical approaches has become less clear cut. And I keep insisting that epidemiology has to do with coming up with a good question, developing a study design to answer that question, and applying stringent quality assurance and quality control procedures. That's mainly what epidemiologists do. Biostatistics is crucial, absolutely crucial. It's key, it's vital, but it's not epidemiology, in my opinion. So that's another change over the years. And I won't say any more like that.
All right. I think we had a wonderful hour. Everybody join us at 1:30 upstairs in Finestone. Up the stairs, I think you know where to find it. We'll have a reception. We'll get a word from the two deans who didn't get to speak now. And join me again in thanking Dr. Szklo. Thank you.